Hello, everyone. How are we doing? Wow, that's lunch put you to sleep. All right. Well, we're going to talk about the prototyping mindset. I'm curious, how many of you work on sort of early stage product development type work? A few of you? Most of you? Okay, that's cool. Nice. All right, so my name is Marty Haught, and I am not a Java programmer anymore. I used to do that many, many years ago. But I've been building software for 19 years. And I would say, when I was putting these slides together, that 16 of those years have been spent doing early stage product development, prototyping, mostly in the startup space. And the lessons I'm going to talk about today have emerged from that. I now run a small software consultancy in Colorado, and I've been doing that for 11 years. And we now focus solely on prototyping. We used to do rescues and some mentoring, but we primarily do prototyping. And I've noticed that, of course, each and every product is a little bit different, but there are these sort of unifying themes and practices that help make prototyping go a lot faster and bring products to market. I'm going to tell you about this project that we had a few years ago, Hidden Genius. And it was interesting because it went really well in the beginning, and then it started to struggle after a couple months. So the client approached us, and they had a very grand vision for creating a sort of crowd-driven platform that would identify technology challenges that could eventually become competitions that companies could compete and build solutions that make our world better. It's a great idea, sort of a Kickstarter meets SpaceX or something like that. And we were happy to build it, and we had a fairly tight time constraint, though. They had 2 months, because in 2 months they were going to present this to the MIT Media Lab, and they're going to use this product in their class to vet ideas. So the game was on. We had to definitely deliver this, and we had no problem. We were able to build something in 6 weeks. It's fairly focused with a minimal feature set. And we were able to demo it. It worked in the class. It went great. We were able to help them focus on being lean and delivering just what they needed for the demo, and it worked. But what happened next was a bit perplexing. We've helped a lot of different companies over the years, and typically they were pretty motivated to get their product to market. But this one sat for another 16 months before it was used by users. How do we go from 2 months, successful demo was maybe 50% feature complete or close, and take 16 months? Now, some of the things that happened were out of the control of the client and our team's hands, so that was understandable, but that really is no excuse. And when I thought back about the early year or two of this project, I came to this quote that is so true. And I think this was the heart of the matter, that really wanted to polish and perfect all of what they were doing before they let anyone see it, because they were going to be embarrassed that, oh, well, you can only get a first impression, and then they're going to leave. They're not going to use the product. They won't get it. They had lots of excuses, but I think this was a missed opportunity. And the thing is, this is not unique to this project. I've seen this many times where clients, they don't want to let users start using their stuff until it's been perfect in their eyes. So we're going to talk about the minimum viable product. How many of you have heard this term, MVP? Familiar with it? Okay, pretty much everyone here. This is a great term. It comes from Lean Startup, and you can see here's how Eric describes it: a product with just enough features to gather validated learning about the product and its continued development. And I want to really focus on the fact this is about learning and tight feedback loops, because prototyping really is about that. You're trying to figure out what to build with the least amount of effort and make sure that it's going to have a good reception for your users. And so the prototyping process and the mindset that we're going to talk about today is what I view as the best way to reach an MVP for your product. So some questions of why we might want to prototype. Because some people might say, well, let's build the real thing. Why do we need to use a prototyping process versus our traditional process? Well, we're going to talk about some of that, but I see that prototyping and this approach is the fastest, most cost-effective way to bring a product to your users and to the market. It reduces time to market, which for most of the products and the clients that we have, time to market is their top value that they really want to hit. And easily collect user feedback early. So collecting user feedback is going to be key to a lot of what we do. We're going to hear it a lot in this talk. And prototyping allows you to get that a little more easily. So yeah, we prototype because we don't know if our solution will solve the right problem. And oftentimes when we see a project come in, we ask about the problem and the solution because sometimes they're suspect. And what's interesting about this and where the prototyping mindset, or at least my impetus to write about it and create this talk, was last year we had a fairly experienced developer join our team that had never done any prototyping. And he struggled. He wanted to build software in the way he had been raised to build software, and it was at odds with the rest of the team. So during our one-on-ones and over the course of the project, we talked about all the various ways that was creating friction and wasn't working so well in the project. And so that is what led me to start to talk about the prototyping mindset. So I view the prototyping mindset, at least the theory or the underpinning of it, is that it's keeping your focus on the fastest, most efficient way to validating your products and knowns. So we're sort of seeing a theme here where this is very much out of the lean startup camp, but I don't feel that you need to, with a prototyping mindset, follow any strict policy, like follow lean startup, because I tell you what, only 2 clients over the last 7 or 8 years since we started using lean startup principles have actually wanted to do it for real. Most of them have no interest in doing all the things in lean startup. And that's fine. But we can still apply these ideas to more traditional projects or more traditional clients that aren't willing to go whole hog on customer development and all that. So we're going to cover 6 keys to prototyping today. And this is a very vast topic. I couldn't quite fit everything into this talk. I didn't really want to talk for more than 50 minutes anyway. And I think these 6 keys will give you a nice foundation that you can take back and apply to how you're building software now. So the first key is know the roadmap. This is the first part that we start off. We start off at the beginning where we're trying to figure out what we're building and why. This piece is going to be critical because you're going to be using it as the basis for how to make decisions and how to proceed as you go through building your prototype and your MVP. So how do I define a roadmap? There are lots of definitions out there. The way I think of it in this case is that it's a plan that identifies the problem, the solution, and how the product will address those needs. You'll often see these as a set of features, UI mockups, user stories. That's typically how it comes to you. The thing that you won't see in roadmaps commonly is that they will talk about all their assumptions and the unknowns, but they should. So let's look at the traditional mindset around roadmaps and sort of the reason we build products. Traditional mindset accepts the roadmap at face value, doesn't know to ask about how it came to be. It assumes the business has done their homework, that we don't need to question them on how they arrived at their conclusions, and doesn't question the problem or the solution. We're just happy to build what they've asked us to build. In contrast, the prototyping mindset is one that sort of is questioning everything about what we're doing and why. So asks about the problem and the solution, because oftentimes there might be some flaws there, might be something they overlooked. Identifies key features, because if you're going to build an MVP, You need to really know what is the heart of your product and make sure you're building just that, or at least you focus on that initially. And seeks to list assumptions and unknowns, because we're going to be using this list later on. So there's some common roadmap pitfalls that I see. The first one is that they're established without engineering involvement. And this is always a sad situation when I see it, because many times I can tell that an engineer did not set out this roadmap because it's got flaws and it maybe has some things that aren't going to work out so well for building an MVP. And what's even worse about this is, well, of course, we could have talked about these things when we're discussing the ideas and could have avoided them or attuned them to be a more reasonable thing to build in an MVP, but that oftentimes stakeholders sign on to the roadmap agreeing to spend a certain amount of budget or money, and they aren't really interested in revisiting that. And so you might have to proceed with a flawed plan that maybe is doomed to fail if they're not willing to adjust. The other pitfall that I see a lot is assumptions are presented as fact. It is a common pattern I've seen in founders that they convince others, including themselves, that these assumptions are true, that they are a given, and that the project places a lot of emphasis on the fact that these things are true, so that when the product finally goes live, things don't go so well. It's because these assumptions were never really validated and tested, and thus the product fails or dies in the vine or what it might be, because they didn't do this early on. And it's sad because they could have done this immediately and known either we have to change course or maybe we shouldn't build this thing after all. If we look at Hidden Genius, they had a lot of interesting assumptions. The question is, will people care enough to spark technology challenges that are actionable, that someone might want to create a competition out of? Will there be companies that are willing, will see these competitions in the time that is given and want to compete? A lot of unknowns, a lot of questions, and these are things that we want to identify very early on to see, can we validate those or test them before we get too far along in the process? The final piece of the Know the Roadmap key is what I call the product compass, and it's really made of 3 parts: where the product is headed and why, a list of assumptions and unknowns that we want to validate, and the essential value proposition, the core essence of the product that people are going to be, hell yeah, I really want to use this. And with these items, you now can have a bearing and know how to go through building out the product with these items. So key number 2, focus scope. Prioritizing what to build and what to defer is your first step along narrowing down your MVP to something that you can reasonably knock out quickly. And it is rare that I've seen product owners able to scope down their product to an MVP or something they can build in 6 weeks or not. So it's something that we as developers, as engineers, want to help them along. The traditional mindset in this area really is pretty hands-off about scope. We view scope as an external concern that we are not part of. We're not supposed to be making that decision. We don't question the value of a feature. We're happy to build everything they're putting in front of us, even if some of those features may be questionable. Like, why are we building this now? Because I don't see how this is critical to this product right now. Sure, I can understand it's important later on, but why are we building it now? We don't question that. And we don't offer ways to limit scope when we are building out certain features. If we look at the prototyping mindset, we focus the scope on what's important. We know what those key values are, the key features. Let's build those. We defer anything that isn't vital because we'll be able to build it later on, but why are we building it now? So we look at that. We also look for ways to test assumptions. As we encounter each of our features, there might be assumption or some unknown that we can test out and improve as we're doing it. We identify that, and we look for ways that we can test it. I want to stop and talk about the complete product vision versus the minimum viable product, because this is a source of friction that I've seen on projects. Product owners, typically when they imagine their product, they've been imagining it for a while. They probably have a grand vision. It's probably a 3 to 5 year view of their product, and it's very difficult for them to see it as a small little thing emerging in an MVP. And because of this reason, they're going to struggle to help you identify what to build in that first 6 months or 6 weeks. So instead, we need to help them identify the core of their product and have that be something that can stand on its own and something that you can build, and allow the rest of the product vision to come later. I think I've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but scope is so important that it's something that we want to apply and limit as much as we can. It has an incredible impact on time and cost, so much so that it's our easiest lever that we can use to help us launch the product early. And I've thought about the sort of applying the CAP theorem to projects, which is sort of time, cost, scope, pick two. Well, scope is the easiest one that you can play with, and it's the one that I recommend. It's a lot easier to deal with than cost and time. My final point here is that you should focus on key high-value features, not just an arbitrary feature list because someone thought it would be useful. I can tell you that a really good product is not the kitchen sink big bag of features. It is really focused, valuable features that help someone solve a problem, and they get that. So don't feel that a long feature list is actually a positive. Let's go to key number 3, measure progress. So how do we know if we're making progress? A lot of times, right, if we're knocking out stories, cards, we're building things to spec, then we're making progress. But that actually really isn't true. I mean, it could be true, but it isn't for certain true. Traditional mindset certainly views it that way. Traditional mindset also considers user feedback another concern, not something that we need to go and worry about. And oftentimes, we're unsure if a feature actually solves the problem. Once we build it, we hand it off, and we're on to the next feature. But I don't recommend this, especially when you're prototyping. Instead, I would use this mindset. Before you build a feature, ask how you're going to gauge success before you start. What does that look like? Are there metrics? Or something we can track? What do we want to hear from the users? What should they be able to do? We want to ask these questions before we get started. Highlights assumptions to test. Again, if there are assumptions or unknowns, we want to figure out what those are that might apply to this feature, and we want to see how we can test those. How can we measure it and be sure that we're actually validating that those assumptions are true or not true? And then we validate value through user feedback. So unless we're getting user feedback, we can't really consider that this is solving the problem of the user. So a reasonable outcome for any feature is that you'll remove or change it significantly. And this is odd. This is one that when new developers come to work with us in prototyping, they're like, well, of course, if we've agreed to build this, we're not going to take it out. But actually, you should. You should consider that. If it's not solving the problem or if it's not working right, you should either remove it or change it. And this is going to be important for us to think about as we go forward. So I consider this the progression of validation, of how we determine that something is successful. The first one is acceptance criteria, and this is a very normal one. This is what we kind of view now, which is, okay, what is the use case, or what should the user be able to do for this feature? Great, that's the acceptance criteria. That's pretty easy. Number 2, after we know that's been handled, is user feedback. We actually have users use it. We ask them how it went, what they thought of it. We talk to them. We figure out if it's working or not for them. The third one is observing behavior. So just because the user told us something doesn't mean they're actually using it or it's actually helping them with some piece. So observing their behavior, which this might be classic usability testing, maybe using heat maps to watch what they're actually doing. But this is where we can determine if indeed the feature is successful. There's a new product I saw, a new service out there called fullstory.com. It's really pretty cool, and it does this easily to drop in, and I'm sure there's others out there. So there's a lot of options for us to observe their behavior. And fourth is engagement metrics. maybe not so useful when you're really starting off very early, but over time, this will become really valuable. And this is something like using KISS metrics or segment or tracking your own data internally in your product. But this is the idea that you're watching what actually happens in your system. You know, how many abandoned carts do you have? How many people are checking out? You know, how, whatever the activity that's important for your domain, you're seeing that that's actually happening and you're tracking it. Because later on, you can compare numbers and you can say quantifiably, yes, this feature improved the product in this measurable way. Here's the Hidden Genius voting widget. And originally, it was a simple +1, -1 for voting. But along the way, I guess the client talked to someone that felt that this was a missed opportunity, and what would be even better is if we had 3 slider bars on a 0 to 10 scale that would tell you how actionable, how achievable, measurable, compelling that this goal or rule or whatever it is about a competition would be. This was not validated all that heavily. We had a few users play with it, but they were already experienced, maybe power users in the system, and there were never any sort of tracking of metrics of seeing how users generally across the whole board were using this product, were using this voting mechanism. So what's interesting here is that if the common user was daunted by this or didn't know how to use it and they never voted, was that more valuable than a simple +1, -1? I don't know. But this is an example of where you might make a change and you think this is fantastic, but if users aren't using it or if they don't get it, not so much. So I recommend you view every feature as an experiment. Each gets validated before you consider it a success. Let's move on to key 4, embrace simplicity. This is where we're going to start to get into some of the ways we build our software. And what I see typically is that we as engineers will overbuild or will build out everything that we can imagine in this case. So the traditional mindset would implement the full feature. We build the feature as it's going to need to be for the length and lifetime of this product. Everything we can imagine, all the edge cases, we're going to build it. Traditional mindset does not seek minimal alternative solutions. We're going to build the real thing that has been requested. And we often complicate features with future proofing. We're trying to predict the future. We're trying to imagine how our system's going to grow over the course of time, and we're going to predict that. We're going to be ahead of the curve and add extra engineering in so that we're ready when that happens. The prototyping mindset in this case takes a different approach. We implement the bare minimum necessary, whatever it takes to get it out there to users so we can validate it. That's what we want to do, and nothing more. We look for minimal code alternatives. I'll give you a nice example of that in a moment. And we build in small composable parts. And I will also explain that in a moment. This is a great quote. And this reminds me of something, of a situation I had a couple months ago. I had a prospective client approach me about this new product that he wanted to build. And in there, we were going through all the different features. And there was one point where a product would go through a complex approval process. And he had just a big box of, approval process. And I asked, well, what does that look like? What does that entail? And he's like, well, it's pretty complicated. And, I've got some ideas on how that's going to work. And I said, well, could we, for now, just have, when they want to request approval, it's in an email to the admin who would be doing the approval. And then they can go back and forth like an email and figure out what needs to happen. And then when it's all said and done, the admin can then click approved, like in a back end. Would that work? He's like, yeah, that'd be great. This is a great example of where you think of a way that you can validate something about your product without writing code or writing very little code. And what's really nice about this particular situation is that, one, he didn't really know what that approval process was. He was going to try and figure it out, but there's probably a good chance he would not get it right the first time. But instead, he makes it manual. He now can document and go through the process of what that approval flow looks like and figure out what's worth building and what's not worth building. All the time, the product's getting used and they're learning about things. The other piece is, what if it turns out no one really wants their project approved, or it's very infrequent? These are great things to learn, and something that if we had built what he originally thought would need to be built right off the bat, that's a lost opportunity that could have avoided a lot of engineering until later when they're really sure about what needed to be built at that point. So we're going to talk a little bit about over-engineering, and this is something that I've certainly done many, many times in my career, and I've seen it happen in lots of my projects, and it's just human nature for us engineers. And that is we're trying to predict the future. We know this has bitten us in the past. We're going to try and future-proof what we're building. Problem is, when we do that, one, we probably aren't predicting the future all that accurately. I don't know about you all, but I think I'm not doing so hot on predicting the future exactly. And of course, the process means more software, which actually bogs down the process and is a liability later on when it needs to change. Which brings me to one of my favorite quotes. You've seen this, I'm sure, from Ward Cunningham, Extreme Programming. What's the simplest thing that could possibly work? This is a great mantra to use as you're prototyping because it really applies here. And its companion phrase, Yagni. You aren't going to need it. I don't know how often I've said this in projects. I say it all the time, and oftentimes it's true. And if it's not true, I want to hear why they really need it and why they actually need it right now, which reminds me of this quote from Ron Jeffries, again, Stream Programming, which I think of as just-in-time programming. You know, if you don't actually need it right now, can we defer it a little bit longer? Because if we can, that is fantastic, and I highly recommend it. I encountered this talk, maybe it was last year, maybe it was 2015. This is a talk by Greg Young called The Art of Destroying Software. And it was a talk he gave in 2014, and he introduced a concept there that we should optimize for deletability in our code. And one thing in particular stuck out as I watched this talk, which is what he called the 1 week rule, that each self-contained part of your system should be able to be rewritten within a week from scratch, and by somebody who doesn't even know what it's supposed to do. I don't know how feasible this is for all the systems, but I tell you what, it's a fantastic idea. And really, this concept isn't new at all because I see this in the Unix philosophy, where you can pipe lots of programs together to make a larger workflow. But it's also at the heart of microservices. Thing is, we can use this approach without going to microservices right off the bat or using some other complicated type of approach. We can simply segment and isolate our code in a monolith or wherever with the idea that we have these imaginary service boundaries and we try not to violate those boundaries and remove coupling. So when I think about this, I think about optimizing for deletion, I think that there's a number of benefits that we gain. Because we have these defined sort of contracts and ways that these parts work together, you have less coupling. That's a positive. These, of course, are smaller, less complex units, so that's great. And it reduces the cost of change. So for our prototyping mindset, this is like gold because if we get it wrong, if we didn't, guess the future correctly, or all of a sudden this little component needs to be rewritten, it's not a big deal. You didn't lose a lot. And as long as you didn't grossly misidentify how the system should work, you can just replace a part here and there, and you can move forward. So you don't have to worry about predicting the future because you know you can replace any little part without too much effort. So if we look at our voting widget, could we have built a simple approve, disapprove mechanism, and that would have worked well enough? I think it would have. And we wouldn't have had to worry about if we got it wrong, we could just rewrite some part if that wasn't valuable. And we wouldn't have had to guess if we need to build out all this. We could have built a much simpler thing. So my last thought here is really a good one, which is if it's not absolutely necessary, defer the decision. So important. So move on to key 5, avoid feature polishing. Feature polishing is an interesting thing. It's something actually I want every engineer to be able to do. It's a very positive thing. But it's a positive thing that you want to do when you know your feature is going to stick around, which is not when you're prototyping. So what are some examples of feature polishing? Pixel perfect UI, honing the user experience. These are all like really positive things. These are great when it's time to do it. So the traditional mindset here is going to embrace feature polishing as a given. Of course, that's how we're building our code. Why would we build anything less? Why aren't we shipping our best possible code every time? That's the traditional mindset. And that usually is how you should work. unless you're prototyping. So prototyping looks at good enough. Builds a good enough version quickly. Focuses on quality where it matters, when it's key to validation, sure. We don't want to write bad code. This is not rewriting crappy code. This is just we are writing good enough code. We're implementing the feature just well enough to validate it and be a solid foundation to build upon. That's what we want. Polishing a feature that gets removed or changed is waste, and we don't want waste. So we don't want to polish early. And really, when I think about it, you gain more value by validating your next feature than polishing something that's good enough. And there's a point where that might change, but you'll know, and then you can say, okay, now it's time to polish these things because they're really, really good, and that's fine. But you have to make sure you're at that point, and not just because that's how you always develop software. So true. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. I've seen this quote like in 100 variations over time. It's a great one. It's a great one to think about when you're thinking about feature polishing. So we're on to our sixth key here, which is understanding trade-offs. So what happens when our experiment succeeds and becomes production code? It's likely to happen, and we need to know how to proceed. So the thing I think about once a feature's been validated, you have some options here. You could stick with what's good enough. That's fine. You could certainly do that until it's more where there's enough business value or reason, motivation to make it better. You could polish what you have if that's justifiable. That's great. You can modify based on feedback, so maybe there's some adjustments you need to make. Or maybe you rewrite it because you learned a lot about how this feature should function, and now you know a better way, a way that you want to implement now so you can go forward with it. So it's totally fine to rewrite it if that's what's valuable. And of course, you can remove it if the feature failed, but we're looking at features that had some validation and worked. I'm going to mention the cost fallacy. And this is something to be aware of. So the sunk cost fallacy, if you're not familiar with it, I'll use an example of, let's say you go out and you buy a case of Twinkies. And you decide that's a good idea, and you love Twinkies, so you start eating Twinkies. And then maybe you've eaten a quarter of the case, and you start feeling bad. So you go to the doctor, and you talk to the doctor about you're feeling bad, and he's asking you what's going on, what's any changes lately, and you're like, oh, I started eating Twinkies, a lot of Twinkies every day because I bought this case of them. And he'd be like, well, you gotta stop eating Twinkies because that's killing you. It's making you feel bad, so stop doing that. You're like, oh, okay, all right. So you go home, and you look at the case of Twinkies, and even though the doctor told you that it's bad for you, you shouldn't be eating Twinkies anymore, you need to cut it out, you're like, inside your head, I just paid a lot of money for this case of Twinkies, I'm not gonna waste my money, I'm gonna eat the Twinkies. That's a sunk cost fallacy. And the thing is, this applies in lots of places in our lives, but especially in software. If you've invested a lot of time and effort into building some code or some feature or whatnot, you don't want to just throw it away because you invested so much. But if you get to the point where it's clear this is now a liability, it's not helping your product, it's not good, you should get rid of it. Don't imagine the value that you've sunk into it as a good enough reason to keep it around if you have other reasons to get rid of it. So beware of the sunk cost fallacy. The other one I think is really important, and I stress with my team, is for every shortcut you put in, you have to have a strategy to make it right. So if you're prototyping and you're making shortcuts and you're thinking of ways to more quickly validate your features, that's great, except for at some point you're going to have to fix those if those features stay in. You have to have strategies before you get going because you don't want to paint yourself into a corner and maybe choose a bad shortcut and now it's too difficult or too painful for you to now remove it. Think about that before you go forward with your shortcut. And the final piece here is about unfinished parts. And when I'm prototyping on a project, we have this conversation before we even get started. Especially important for the product owner is that we need to understand that we will be leaving unfinished parts behind, so we need to be able to go back and finish them. So don't think that once something's validated, okay, let's go to production, let's crank it up and up the volume. It's like, well, let's make sure that all the unfinished parts that are important need to get in there. So you need to have that conversation with your team about that. So question about what can you do? That completes our 6 points. I've talked about a number of things here that you could use, you can put into practice. It may be that some of your environments, and I don't know if this is true for you because most of you do raise your hand that you're doing prototyping or at least early stage development, that you may not be able to do all the things I mentioned here today. And that's, it is what it is. And hopefully you can see what you can apply and you can have conversations with the team and with other stakeholders back at your place where you can determine if there's something that they might be open to. I encountered this story not too long ago about ING Bank, which is a Netherlands bank, a multinational corporation that is pretty much firmly in the enterprise, and they adopted this new model called scaling agile, which I had only heard about recently. And the short version is that these are small cross-functional teams that they call squads that own their customer-facing product end to end. So these teams have people like business folks, marketing, business analysts, data analytics, whatever, alongside engineers, designers, all working together, a small team, like maybe 9 or 10 people. And they're responsible for everything. So they totally can do all these practices in their little slice of their service. So I think this is really fascinating because here's a enterprise corporation that has adopted this across its organization. And it's very encouraging to see this because if they can do it, then what other organizations, what could they do? Could they adopt this as well? And I think the answer is yes. So if you want to go out, you can Google this. There's plenty of information on scaling agile, or you can look up ING. It's also known as like the Spotify method or something like that. I guess Spotify is the one who sort of prototyped this, I guess. But it's very interesting, so go look it up. So applying these ideas, there's a few ideas I want to leave you with before we jump into questions, which is I think you should invoke Yagni whenever it makes sense. That's something you can do, I think, in any project. You can reduce the complexity of your solutions. I think that's an opportunity you have regardless of whether you get to talk about scope and how you measure your progress. And focus on learning in tight feedback loops. So always push to have the tightest feedback loop you can and to always be learning about what really works for your users and what doesn't. All right, thank you. So questions? No questions, really? Yes? Okay. Right, so the question is, when I talked about getting your code to users as fast as possible, was I meaning end users, did I mean a select group of users? And the answer is, it's definitely the end users. It could be initially, when you're starting off, these would typically be early adopters. So these are people that really have the problem you're solving and are willing to work with a very early alpha of your products. People that are probably a little more sympathetic to your cause, to your maybe your founders, whatnot, but they have the problem. So it's not just the product owner, it's not just the internal team, QA, whatever. It is somebody who actually would use the software, and you get to their hands as soon as you can. So typically, I would want to see maybe 2 or 3 weeks. We have something that these people can use, possibly. Maybe not that fast, depending on how fast you can prototype. You might be a little further on, but as soon as possible, like 1 feature is ready or 2 features are ready, and that's it. I want to see users play with it. I want to see them use it and get feedback from them.
Yeah, I was, I guess, more curious, just as a follow-up, like how do you ensure that you don't lose their trust? Again, like you mentioned that you want to get it out as fast as possible. There might be flaws.
Mm-hmm.
You might kind of lose their trust or lose their interest. It's not matching up your expectations.
Right, so the question you have is that you might lose the trust and the interest of these users if you ship something too early that's so flawed that they'll be like, blow you off because it's not worth it. So the answer is, if your product isn't that compelling, that these key features because we're talking about shipping the key features first. We're not talking about shipping, oh, you can log in and change your profile or something like that. You know, like we don't care about that. That's sort of things we need to do, but that's not the value proposition of your product. The value proposition whatnot. So if they get that feature and they're pretty meh on it, that's a really damaging sign that wow, maybe our product isn't that interesting after all. I mean, it's up to you to decide, is this feature actually usable? I'm not talking about, you know, you've got 1 or 2 screens. I'm talking about a feature that is end-to-end valuable on its own. So like, you know, whatever your product does, hopefully you can implement something quickly that they can play with. And sure, it's not complete. They can see how it's not fully formed, but they can also see how it's solving their problems, and they're happy to play with it. So you have to find users that are willing to do that, and they do exist. Yeah. Yep. Yep. I can. Sure. So the question is, as you're building out these new features, you eventually get them to production, and then you have the production app out there, but you still have new features that are going to be going through a similar process. How do you do that and get it out there and maybe not disrupt what's in production, right? Well, there are a number of ways, and you definitely can do this. So one possibility, if something is so, you know, unfinished, you might use something called feature flags, where you keep this new feature that is really half-baked hidden from your existing users that are using the product. So this is like a more mature thing. So probably post-MVP, right? That you would say you want to do something new, but it's not quite ready for everyone. Well, you can have feature flags to have only a small number of users have access to it in production, and then as you're seeing success, then you can flip the bit and more users across your entire product can start using it. And you can definitely do that in any mature product, platform or product as well. So that's that approach. I would say that also in general, you are constantly shipping stuff. So if you have an environment where you can't ship features really quickly. So like we ship several times a day typically, and it's effortless. So maybe it's a 5-10 minute process to get things out. Again, because we're prototyping, we don't have a large, huge code base, so that's feasible. When you're in that phase, you can really ship quickly. And most of the people that are using this when you're like in an alpha, they understand that things might break. And so the idea is that, well, things might break, but you also can fix things incredibly quickly. So they understand this, so anything that stays broken isn't going to stay broken for very long. If you don't have the ability to ship quickly, then you would want to be a little more careful, but I think at that point you're not really prototyping, right? You're in a different way of being. Anyone else? Alrighty, well, thank you everyone. I'm happy to take more questions or talk to anyone offline about this if you would like.